I'm delighted to welcome Michelle Norris, Director of the Geary Institute, to present today's seminar. Now, Michelle is so well known for her research in housing, and this work is representative of her ERC-funded project, Equal House. And today, Michelle is going to be presenting on work on land policy's influence on the resilience and fragility of social housing systems. So it's comparative work looking at Austria, England, and the Netherlands. And we may also have some words about some policy for Ireland. So, Michelle, without further ado.
And it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you for asking me to present to the group. So as Darren mentioned, this paper draws on a Rise in Europe project in which I'm involved with other colleagues from the Geary Institute and the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice, called Equal House, which looks at the scale and drivers of housing inequality in the European Union and the UK, and government responses to housing inequality. Today I'm looking at the role of land policy, and particularly policy on the provision and access of land for social housing. And I'm happy to take some questions on Ireland, but since we don't essentially have a policy, I was unable to include it as a case. But just to say, the focus of this presentation is on social rented housing. The term has kind of a wide variety of meanings. So in some countries it means accommodation to purchase, whereas I'm particularly looking at social rented housing, and I'm focusing on three countries: Austria, England and the Netherlands, and how their policy has changed over the long term and since World War II, essentially. My work on this area was inspired by a frustration with the academic literature on social housing, of which there is a huge literature, particularly focused on Western Europe, which is essentially the only region in the world with large social housing sector. It does exist in high-income Asian countries, and a very small sector in North America, Canada, Australia. But there is a very large literature on social rented housing in Western Europe, and as I work in this area, I'd read, and I was frustrated by the fact that, firstly, it's heavily dominated by what I call declinist narratives. So famously, housing and social housing particularly is commonly characterised as a wobbly pillar under the welfare state, in the sense that it's particularly since the 1980s been much more subject to retrenchment, cuts in public subsidies. The sector has shrunk in some countries, particularly in the former communist bloc countries in Eastern Europe, where their big state-owned housing sector has been almost entirely privatised. There's a big focus on it, the reduction of the sector in size, and then an associated development, which is residualisation, in the sense that the sector focuses increasingly on accommodating a small residue of the population, and generally low-income households. But as we'll go on and see, this is far from a correct characterisation of the sector. So in some countries, particularly in Western Europe, the sector has grown since the 1980s, quite substantially. And in other countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, the sector is experiencing a big revival. So countries like Spain, parts of Spain, I should say, countries like Slovenia, etc. So this kind of characterisation I felt was far from entirely accurate. My other frustration with the literature is that the literature on social housing is almost entirely focused on what I call kind of macro level political economy type explanations of why we've had this decline. So I won't go through all the details of the various authors, but in summary, the literature argues that housing has certain characteristics that make it social housing prone to retrenchment and less stable than other parts of the welfare state. One of it is asset value. and the fact that property rights are central to market economies means it's much more, prone to, lack of willingness of government to subsidise the sector. Housing's played a very important role in resolving major socioeconomic crises. For instance, after World War II, massive population growth, the return of lots of young men from the front, forming new households. We saw expansion in social housing during that period, but we saw, when those crises were resolved, the sector contracted. And others focus on how you pay for housing. So, unlike other welfare services, generally we have to pay for social housing up front before we consume it. So we pay for pensions incrementally as we consume them. And also social housing tenants generally pay lower rents, so that raises issues just about. So they're the kind of fundamental drivers of the contraction of the sector. Then the literature highlights kind of more proximate drivers, that the socioeconomic challenge of social housing was set up to confront or deal with after World War II have ended. Housing markets now run much more efficiently, so they can address the needs of the vast majority of the population, and the bit of the population that are left aren't politically powerful. And then there's obviously other debates around the rise of neoliberalism, the declining electoral power of the working class, and then there's also a debate just about the kind of delegitimisation of social housing as a solution to socioeconomic problems. So as I said, my view is the picture is much more complex. So in this paper and the other work we're doing on solutions to housing inequality in Equal House, rather than focusing solely on the fragility of social housing and its tendency to shrink over the long term, I'm interested in also looking at the resilience of the sector and the significant vestiges of resilience that persisted, and I'm interested in looking at why the sector has been resilient in some countries and fragile in others. And also, rather than looking at these big macro political economy developments, I focus more on the internal design of the social housing sector. So I have an overall thesis that the social housing sector has an internal type political economy, a micro-political economy, if you like. Because unlike other welfare services, in most countries where the sector is large, it's largely self-financed from tenants' rents. Rents are set at cost recovery level. The sector has assets it can sell and further self-fund. And also in most countries, Ireland's one of the Western European countries where the sector is all on the government balance sheet. So that's very unusual. So for that reason, there are kind of internal design factors that influence the fragility and resilience of social housing, much more so than other welfare services that are funded entirely or almost entirely by. So we're looking at a whole range of these issues in Equal House, but today I'm going to focus specifically on land, which, at the risk of stating the obvious, is obviously vital for housing provision, because we can't build houses floating on air. It's also usually a very, very large component of the costs of housing delivery, typically between 15 and 30% currently in Ireland, land costs. So therefore, if you have government involvement in providing land for social housing, that's potentially an enormous subsidy, either in cash or in kind, keeping down land prices for social housing delivery, and therefore a huge contributor to the resilience of the sector. And one of the reasons I'm particularly interested in land is it was actually an area of very, very significant activism, state activism, particularly after World War II in Western European countries. It still is in some countries, but it's often forgotten about as a very important contributor, land policy. Now, so in Equal House, we're actually looking at every single European country. Actually, I was going to say including the UK, but obviously they're a European country, every single EU member, including the UK. But today I'm focused on 3 countries, which are Austria, the Netherlands and England. And I'm going to look at the kind of tendency of the sectors to expand in resilient cases over the long term, and in particular the role which land policy has played in insulating social housing sectors from these macro political economy factors that have undermined them. So, for instance, the election of a government that's ideologically unsympathetic to the sector, the cuts to public spending, etc. Now, the three cases I've chosen, Austria, the Netherlands and England, I've chosen primarily because, well, as we'll see, they have quite different trajectories in terms of land policy over time, but also they have quite different trajectories in terms of the size of the social housing sector over time. So in terms of the three cases, Austria, which is in the black on the graph, is probably the most resilient case. Now, I should mention it's very hard to get proper historical data on the size of the social rented sector. But in Austria in 1980, social housing accommodated about 16% of the population, and by 2020 it had grown to 23% of the population. So it's extremely high. The Dutch system, to my knowledge, the Dutch have the highest level of social housing in the world, maybe except for Singapore, maybe. It's probably not comparable to social housing in Europe, but it's a state-owned housing. And in the Netherlands, the sector peaked at just under 40% of households in 1990. So in parts of Amsterdam, it would be the majority of households in 1990. And you can see the sector shrunk, then contracted as a proportion of households since then. It started to grow again, and there's increasing emphasis by the latest Dutch government on expanding the sector, but it's still now 34% of households, so still one of the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world, but compared to its post-war peak, smaller. So if Austria is considered a very resilient case, the Dutch are considered probably resilient in the short term, but not over the long term. And then the final case is England. So I should explain that traditionally housing policy has been relatively devolved between England and Scotland, but since the advent of devolution in the UK under Tony Blair, housing has been completely devolved to the different jurisdiction and countries of the UK. So, and policy has diverged quite substantially, particularly between England and Scotland. So for that reason, I chose just to focus on England. So you can see from the graph that England's probably the least resilient of the cases we're looking at. So by 1980, the size of the social housing sector peaked in England at about a third of the population. It then began to contract very radically, largely because of the privatisation introduced by the Margaret Thatcher government, the right to buy sales of council housing. But it's since continued to contract, largely because of changes in funding, but as we see also because of changes in land policy. And the sector now accommodates 16.5% of households in England. So large, about twice the size of the Irish sector, just put that in context, but not compared to the historic norm. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on comparing the different countries in long-term perspective since World War II. And normally, I should have mentioned in my introduction, the literature on social housing focuses on a lengthy period of expansion of the sector in the post-war period, the so-called post-war golden age of social housing, and then on its decline relative to that period. So just in terms of organising the paper, I focused on the interventions in the post-war decades and then comparing them to what's happened in more recent decades. Okay, so in terms of the post-war decades, there's quite a significant difference between the three countries I'm examining. So in the Netherlands, there was probably the strongest tradition of active management of land by government in the certainly in Europe, probably in the developed world in the post-war decade. So by active management of land, I mean government actively purchasing land, servicing land, in other words, adding the power, water, sewage infrastructure you need to build on the land, and then selling it on to the private sector or for social housing for construction. So this policy was highly activist, but it was also generalist. It was targeted at all housing provision, not just social housing provision. So between the mid-1950s and the mid-1990s, Dutch municipalities, local government, bought almost all development land in the Netherlands. They assembled it into sites, serviced the sites, which obviously in the context of the Netherlands, 1/3 of the Netherlands is below sea level. So, dealing with, sea defences is extremely expensive. Essentially, a lot of the country is blanket bog, so drainage, etc., is extremely expensive. So in the context of the Netherlands, land servicing is much, much more expensive than in the other case study countries, and indeed in Ireland. So in contrast to all the other countries, Dutch municipalities did this almost entirely after World War II. And certainly until the 1990s, there was essentially no private market in land. I should say, even though I'm focusing on housing, there was very limited private market in land for any type of construction, not just social housing. So this picture here is the town of Lelystad. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's one of the Dutch new towns. A lot of the both England and the Netherlands had a very strong programme, and France, of building new towns after World War II. And this is just the initial plan for the town. I just put it up as an example of how they typically did the land servicing. So they bought the plots, they planned the entire town, or they planned the urban extension in detail. They split them up generally into squares, I've noticed from researching this, and then they sold them on to housing providers, which in the Netherlands is housing associations, non-profit sector providers, or to the private sector. And as I mentioned, commercial developers and also social housing landlords played little or no role in land servicing until the 1990s. So I mentioned this is kind of a generalist approach for developing, for managing of land and supply of land for all types of development, residential, commercial, etc. So how did it impact social housing? It had a very strong impact, but an indirect impact, and it really bolstered the sector, enabled the sector's growth. And the fact that this persisted right until the 1990s is one of the key explanations, in my view, why Dutch social housing output continued to grow right until the 1990s. So it benefited the social housing sector indirectly by cutting land prices and ensuring land availability for social housing. So there's quite a lot of economic research on Dutch land markets during this period, because obviously it's of interest. And they had extremely low increases in prices, including for residential developments right until the 1990s. So it ensured land was relatively cheap, dealt with the land servicing costs, and also ensured very extensive availability for social housing. Now, even though the system wasn't necessarily designed in this way, it had important indirect benefit or direct benefits for social housing as well. So higher prices, even though the land was sold at cost recovery levels to private developers, they charged cost and a small premium on top, and this money cross-subsidised. It meant private development, private residential land sales cross-subsidised social housing developments. Also, the land policy was a very, very important part of the general Dutch social housing policy and the emphasis on growing social housing. So at the time, municipalities were getting quite high subsidies from central government for social housing, house building. And critically, if the costs of servicing land were particularly high, the subsidies for social housing were particularly high, and it encouraged the municipalities to provide more land for social housing if they were in difficult to develop sectors. And critically, it also encouraged them to develop very large social housing developments. This is one in Rotterdam, just by illustration. But this is quite typical of the kind of late post-war social housing in the Netherlands. And it also so encouraged them to funnel as much social housing into very difficult to develop sites, not necessarily in peripheral areas, but difficult to service, and develop very large schemes. So from the point of view of kind of my analysis on resilience and fragility of the sector in terms of growth, proportion of population accommodated in social housing, this is one of the reasons why the Netherlands was resilient. Now, of course, this had huge downsides in the sense that the Dutch now have far too much post-war social housing that needs upgrading, etc. This far in, and they now have quite high rates of demolition, which is one of the reasons why the sector is shrinking. They also have debates, particularly around socio-spatial segregation, not really on incomes necessarily, but particularly in relation to different ethnic groups. So it's not a completely uncomplicated picture. I just want to emphasise, but in terms of the size of the sector, land was an enormously valuable, invisible subsidy. So when I want to go on and look at England, and in the not quite the entire post-war period, but certainly from 1945 until the early 1960s, there was also a very radical activist targeted land management policy in England. So many social policy scholars will know that in the post-war period there was a Labour Party government elected just after the war, and it essentially established the entire British welfare state just in a 5-year period, the NHS, free second level education, etc., large sections of the social security system. So they were equally radical in relation to housing, and they introduced subsidies for social housing, council housing in this case provided by local government, and also radical legislation. They established the town planning system, modern town planning system in the 1946 legislation, that also legislated for compulsory purchase of land at existing use value for building social housing and also for building new towns. And the British, in the post-war period, particularly in England, there was a very extensive programme of building new towns. And this is just a kind of map of the new towns constructed in the post-war period. So when I say existing use value, what I mean is if there were sheep in a field, you bought land and there were sheep in fields full of sheep or cows or indeed any farm animals, you paid agricultural use prices for it. And the government had the power to compulsorily purchase the land, as they did in the Netherlands, I should have mentioned. The powers were very rarely used. Just the fact the powers were in place was generally enough for landowners to play ball on these compulsory purchases. So the Labour Party introduced this quite radical system of kind of essentially decommodification of land, focused in particular on social housing and the new towns, but the new towns contained a lot of social housing. They also introduced other measures to control land markets in general, and they introduced taxes in 1946 that captured the full, what planners call betterment value of land plus planning permissions. So they'd introduced planning permissions, or at least in a more organised, comprehensive way in 1946. They knew prices were going to go up, reflecting planning, and they introduced taxes that levied tax at 100% of the increase in price. So it wasn't just on social housing, there were other quite radical measures. Now, unlike in the Netherlands, where there was just a general consensus that this was a good thing, supported by all parties and all municipalities, even though there was no legal obligation by Dutch municipalities to engage in this land banking. In Britain, by contrast, this proved highly contentious. And when the other elements of the welfare state set up by the post-war Labour government weren't rolled back when the Conservatives got back into government in Britain, they were extremely quick to roll back the active land management legislation. So there was a series of kind of tit-for-tat type land reforms in land policy, Labour would get in and reinstitute change, the Conservatives rolled them back. But the most significant development was the Land Compensation Act 1961, which required the state by law to pay full market value for land compulsorily purchased, including what's called hope value. So if I have sheep in a field, but I hope it's going to be rezoned for housing, that's reflected in the price the state says. So enormous levels of costs were heaped onto social housing providers through this measure. And then there were various measures by Labour, I won't go into them in detail, to try reintroduce these measures later that stayed in place for a very short period and were rolled back by Labour. And interestingly, any of you who are following the British newspapers will have noticed, no doubt, that Angela Rayner, who's the Deputy Prime Minister and is tasked with leading their housing initiative, the Labour government's housing initiative in Britain, the newly elected government, one of the first things she's announced is that they're going to introduce similar active land management measures and new towns. So that's quite interesting. So how did these work in practice? So the general controls on land prices introduced after World War II, these taxes on betterments, had very little impact because essentially there was no private market throughout the 1940s and 1950s, and landowners were just not keen on selling unless they were forced to sell, obviously, when they were facing such penal taxes. But the powers to compulsorily purchase, so they had no effect in keeping general prices down, but the powers to compulsorily purchase land for social housing and the new towns remained in place for longer, and they supported very high social housing impact or social housing output in the 1950s. So 1/3 of the social housing built in England since 1945 was built in the 1950s, and they have never achieved the same level of social housing output they've achieved since then. I mentioned the construction of the new towns, enormously significant in terms of housing supply, some more successful than others, socioeconomically I mean, but a large proportion of land in the new towns or of housing in the new towns was social housing. And the compulsory purchase powers were enormously significant in keeping the land costs down for this. So it was a huge invisible subsidy. So this is a picture of the most famous new town, Milton Keynes. Not a very attractive picture, but typical enough, I think, of Milton Keynes. So just to give you an idea of the impact of the measures, the raw land costs, i.e. on-service land costs in Milton Keynes were 1% of the construction costs of Milton Keynes. So that's almost unheard of nowadays. So when the 1916 One Act was introduced, it was rolled back. This obviously had a huge impact on municipalities' councils' ability to churn out the social housing at lower cost. It increased costs, and because they have much more state subsidies in Britain and in England and don't have cost recovery rents, it meant that it depressed the supply. Councils could still compulsorily purchase so-called brownfield sites, particularly slum clearance sites, and this led to kind of an overuse. There's a kind of consensus among researchers of this measure, and an overemphasis on redevelopment of inner cities. And I mentioned social housing output declined. So I just want to go on then and discuss Austria, which is the last case I'm examining. And Austria, contrary to what you'd think, since we hear so much about the wonderful Vienna model of social housing in this country, was a real laggard in terms of active management of land. Now, I should say, obviously, Austria is a federal country, so there is differences between different different regions of Austria, but generally speaking, for most of the post-war period, most land for social housing was bought at full market value. And this was also the case in the interwar period when the very large numbers of municipal social housing were built by Vienna City Council, the famous Red Vienna period. So there were some measures to, try address land values. There was a 1961 tax introduced to mobilise our zoned land for building, like the residential zoned land tax our government introduced and then never implemented. And there was also 1974 legislation to provide local authorities with preemptive purchase rights, in other words, first refusal on land, but again, never really implemented. So despite this, the Austrians still managed to build quite a lot of social housing, not in the post-war period, but in the interwar period. And this is a picture, probably many people know this, of the most famous, I think, probably social housing development in the world, which was built during the Red Vienna period. So this is Karl Marx Hof in Vienna, which you can go on tours of. I've been on a tour of Karl Marx Hof. So the reason they managed to do this was essentially there was a collapse in land prices in the interwar period due to low levels of private construction, particularly in Vienna, strong rent regulation, and that helped to reduce the costs of acquiring land for social housing. So the Vienna municipality managed to double its land holdings to 33% of the city's land area between 1918 and 1913. And they managed to build social housing on the cheap land. But as the economy started to improve in the 1950s, land prices went up and that opportunity evaporated. So that was the post-war period. So a mixed picture of inactive land management in Austria, generalist land management, very active but generous land management in the Netherlands, and very active but targeted mainly at social housing land management in England. So what's happened in the post-war period? So in the post kind of more recent years, post-1980s period. So we've seen quite radical change in land policy in the three countries. So in the Netherlands, we've seen a move from very active land management to much more passive land management by government during that period. And because their land management policy was never underpinned by legislation and municipalities were never obliged to do this, this kind of happened, and it's not accidental is the wrong word, but likely in a quiet way, where a series of policy changes all interacted to push the Dutch municipalities out of land servicing, land management in the same way they used to in the past, even though they still do a lot more of it than we do in Ireland, which is almost zero in Ireland. So in 1988, there was a new national land use planning and development plan that reformed municipalities' land servicing roles. They remained relatively active in land servicing between 1995 and 2005. 68% of new homes were built on land. They assembled, but that proportion has declined year on year since then. And part of the reason is that subsidies for social housing in the Netherlands have been rolled back. In fact, the government have introduced a tax on social housing, which I'm happy to answer questions on. And this 1988 plan envisaged 30% of housing output would be social housing, which is very high by our standards, but quite low by the Dutch post-war norm. And central government subsidies to municipalities for social housing provision, which would underpin the land management model, and also for land servicing, were cut. So municipalities then had to take all the risk on themselves of buying land, servicing it, and recovering all their costs with no backstop from central government, and many of them just withdraw in part or in whole from that activity. So as a result, since 2008, the Dutch have followed the example of the Americans. We also discussed the English, and also in Ireland, and they've introduced inclusionary zoning mechanisms. So in other words, they now require private developers on land they buy, they service, they build on, to hand over a certain proportion to social housing providers for social housing. But as a mechanism for controlling and managing land markets, it's far more reactive than proactive. So in terms of social housing, this had quite a significant impact on the sector. So some municipalities like Amsterdam have very large land banks historically, and they continue to provide land to social housing providers. Other municipalities don't have a lot of land, and they think it's too big a risk, or they're ideologically opposed to the big social housing providers, which kind of debate in the Netherlands, because they're considered too powerful, essentially. So housing associations' reliance on municipalities and land fell from 60% of land bought in 1995 to 15% in 2008. And that, together with reforms to social housing financing, led to a dramatic increase in or decrease in social housing output, and the kind of contraction of the sector we saw on the graph. And the kind of view of Dutch planners is the introduction of inclusionary zoning is kind of the death knell for their active land management approach, because now the private sector will be doing what they were doing previously. But obviously private builders have to build in the risk of not getting planning, much higher servicing costs than they envisaged into house prices and into delivery prices. So it's also blamed, with many other factors, for driving up general prices in the Netherlands. So then in England, what have we seen? So I mentioned that the very radical land management we saw in the post-war period was rolled back in the 1960s by the Tories, and various efforts by Labour to reintroduce it were rolled back. But this has been a kind of a long-term interest for Labour, and in fact Labour was committed in its constitution to land nationalisation right until they, I think, Tony Blair. So I suppose it's an issue they have remained kind of ideologically wedded to. So in England, there was very little involvement in land management by government right until the 1980s. And in the 1980s, some municipalities started to make the funding of infrastructure, including social housing, a condition for granting planning permission. So in other words, they started to engage in this kind of inclusionary zoning, which is a kind of a policy borrowed from the United States. So finally, this became so widespread. We saw these arrangements underpinned by legislation in 1990. Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 empowers local authorities to require developers to hand over dwellings or sites for social housing, like in Ireland, or contribute to other infrastructure provisions, swimming pools, libraries, etc., etc. And everyone in the system calls these Section 106 agreements. And by the early 2000s, these were introduced in practically all English municipalities' development plans. So in terms of its impact on social housing, not as great as the post-war radical measures, but on the other hand, Section 106 has proved far less controversial than previous measures and has remained in place over that period. Maybe because it's less radical, and the costs of infrastructure are just passed on to the ultimate buyers in the end. But also it's true that Section 106 is a far less effective support for social housing than earlier policies. So I mentioned it's reactive to what the market can provide, not proactive in steering land prices. So if private housing output is down, your social housing output is down. It's generally far less effective in reducing costs. And particularly in England, Section 106 financing has proved not effective in delivering and supporting social housing because of other changes in government funding for social housing that have required housing associations, non-profit bodies that now provide most social housing in England, to cross-subsidise social housing development with funding from elsewhere. So it's kind of hard to follow this graph, but the dotted line is total social rented housing output in England since the year 2000. And then the bars are the different components of the dwellings taken under Section 106 agreements. So you can see when Section 106 was introduced nationwide, most of the dwellings taken under Section 106 were social housing. As the policy rolled on, the level of social housing taken under Section 106 remained the same, and more housing was taken for other purposes. So what's called affordable or intermediate rent, so 80% of market rent, it's considered affordable rent under this policy, which is obviously not very affordable in London, and also affordable for sale, and increasingly market value rent, market value for sale. So in theory, this cross-subsidises social housing, and in theory and in practice, I should say. But in reality, because there's been such a cut in central government funding for social housing, it just replaces lost central government revenue. So it has been useful in keeping social housing output at a bare minimum level, even though there's chronic undersupply, but certainly not in protecting the resilience of the sector that's continued to shrink. and it hasn't even replaced the loss of government subsidies. So then the final case I'm examining is Austria. So in Austria, we've essentially seen the opposite development, particularly in Vienna, but also in some of the other Länder in Austria, ones that contain the Austrian cities. It's not as common in the rural area. So we've seen much more active management of land, both by government, but also by what are called limited profit housing associations that provide most social housing in Austria. So they are obliged, or as their name implies, limited profit housing associations. They're allowed by law to make a limited profit on the social housing they construct, which is regulated by law. It's generally 3 to 4%. But they're also obliged by law to reinvest that in social housing provision, and they generally reinvest it in land banking. And in the Austrian system, they have cost recovery rents. They built a lot of housing from the 1960s. The mortgages have been paid down on that housing, and now the housing associations are in quite a strong financial position. And this legislation, their limited profit housing law, requires them to invest in housing, and they've accumulated increasing numbers of land banks. Also, land or regional governments can support social house building by either selling land to social housing providers at cost recovery level, or increasingly leasing the land. And that's a model we see used much more widely around Europe, and also in the US much more widely. And those of you who follow Irish politics will have seen that it was proposed by Sinn Féin in their recent housing strategy. The reasons municipalities do this is they can control the long-term use of the housing, so no one can go privatising it, etc. Doesn't necessarily keep costs down, but it's a way of providing lower cost land into the sector. So in Austria's federal system of government, not all Länder have used these mechanisms, but I mentioned Vienna has been particularly active. So Vienna established a public land banking agency called Wohnfonds Vienna in 1984 to buy land well ahead of zoning, planning, anything, and service the land for social housing. And it currently owns 3.1 million metres squared of sites. And interestingly, it allocates this land through developer competitions. So housing associations, sometimes private developers, get together and they bid for the land. It's given to whoever can produce the social housing for the cheapest costs, and there's other design requirements and who they're attempting to house built into the policy. But it's been very successful in keeping land prices down. Now, in recent years, the model has come under much more strain, and we've seen Länder in Austria much more commonly introducing dedicated zoning for social housing. So in other words, you can only build social housing on this site and nothing else, which has also helped to depress land costs. But we have in Vienna seen a phenomenon where increasingly Wohnfonds is being outbid for land in sites right in the city, and we see the advent of kind of sprawl and developments outside the city centre, social housing developments to keep costs down. So this is kind of hard to follow, but this is a map of the current developer competitions I got from the Wohnfonds Vienna's website. So this is Vienna. So you can see the increasing spread of developer competitions outside the city on the other side of the river. So even in a country like this, they're not immune to these wider pressures. Okay, so just some concluding comments. Land policy and active management of land for social housing is a really important, somewhat invisible and often forgotten support for social housing. It's somewhat invisible because often the full level of the subsidy isn't visible in the national accounts. It can't be measured in that way. But historically, it's been extremely important in supporting the expansion of the sector in Western European countries, where it's grown to some of the largest levels in the world. Certainly, in my view, if you compare the three countries I've looked at, its importance has grown in recent decades because we have seen land prices increase due to planning restrictions, dare I say, due to increased competition from private developers, due to what's called financialisation of land markets, financialisation of housing, more money pushing into investment, particularly in high-value cities in England, Vienna being an example. So the countries that have maintained high social housing output have generally been much more active in land. France is also another example I didn't cover here because I thought 3 was enough. So it's had a significant influence on the resilience and fragility of social housing systems, albeit it's probably not the primary influence, and financing is a key factor in terms of the kind of this so-called internal political economy of social housing. Now, the design of the land management measures exerts a strong influence on their effectiveness too. And like, here's a kind of a preliminary typology of the mechanisms we're looking at in Equal House in terms of land. I can see my colleague Lucy, who's trying to pull this together at the moment, smiling because she hasn't seen this. But you can see that over the post-war period, we saw interventions in the 3 countries we've looked at that were much more decommodifying in focus. So we saw essentially the Dutch replacing land markets with the public land allocation system through compulsory purchase, or it's very common to have preemption rights sometimes at existing use value. In other words, if you're going to sell the land, you have to sell it to the state first. And we saw that in the Netherlands. Other mechanisms aimed at kind of actively steering land markets, so relatively decommodifying mechanisms like we see in Vienna now, where the state land banker buys up land, purchases raw land, secures planning permission, services it, and then parcels it out. So that keeps the price down for social housing providers. Whereas in recent decades, in these 2 of the countries, we've seen a turn towards much more marketised measures that either just subsidise land markets, so we buy land at full market value for social housing, which is what we do in Ireland, by the way, if anyone's interested in Ireland. So we deal with it by just, in Ireland where social housing is 100% state funded, just state taking on the costs entirely. Or we see mechanisms like to levy land markets. So rather than to try control the price, control the provision, we see mechanisms like inclusionary zoning used to just levy builders and ultimately private home buyers, we should always remember, to cross-subsidise social housing. So they're less effective mechanisms for subsidising social housing provision, and therefore less effective in underpinning its resilience. So, thank you.